At 3:50 in the morning on the 31st of July, 1917, 3,000 British guns opened fire simultaneously across the Ypres salient in the Belgian province of Flanders. The sound reached the English coast. In London, people felt it in their chests before they heard it. What followed would last 100 days, consume 300,000 men, advance the British line by 5 miles, and be declared a victory by the man who ordered it. 4 months after that declaration, the British abandoned every inch of what those 300,000 men had taken without firing a shot and gave it back. Before we go further, in the comments, tell me, do you think Passchendaele was a victory? Because the answer depends entirely on what you were told it was fought for and what you were not told at all. Watch until the end, because what you are about to discover will permanently change how you understand the word victory, the word command, and what happens when the men who know the truth decide not to share it with the men who have to approve the plan. To understand what those 3,000 guns actually meant, you have to understand the 12 months before them and the specific constellation of disasters that had gathered over Britain's position on the Western Front by the spring of 1917. The French army was in mutiny, not metaphorically, not as a matter of low morale or reluctance. Legions of French soldiers had refused orders to attack following the catastrophic failure of General Nivelle's great offensive in April of that year. Whole divisions had put down their rifles. Some French armies were temporarily incapable of offensive operations. The extent of the breakdown was so severe that the French government was terrified of what would happen if Germany learned of it. Britain, at that moment, was effectively the only power on the Western Front capable of mounting a significant attack. Simultaneously, Germany had resumed unrestricted submarine warfare. Merchant ships were being sunk faster than they could be replaced. Britain is an island. Its population eats food that arrives by sea. Its army fights with steel and oil and rubber that arrives by sea. The arithmetic of tonnage was being run in Whitehall with genuine anxiety, and the numbers were not reassuring. And Russia was disintegrating. The February Revolution had overthrown the Tsar. The new government was attempting to hold the Eastern Front together, but the attempt was failing. The prospect was real. German divisions freed from the East and transferred to France, arriving in the West before American troops, who had entered the war in April, could arrive in numbers sufficient to matter. The window in which Britain could strike before that transfer happened was not infinite. 3 crises. Each one, taken alone, was manageable. Together, they produced a pressure that made General Sir Douglas Haig's plan for a great offensive in Flanders feel not merely reasonable, but necessary. Before the Passchendaele Ridge lay the Belgian coast. Before the coast lay the port of Ostend and Zeebrugge and the submarine base at Bruges. If British forces could break out of the Ypres salient, drive northeast through the German positions, and reach the coast, the U-boat threat could be neutralized at its source. Admiral Jellicoe, the first Sea Lord, told the War Cabinet in June that unless the Army captured the submarine bases on the Belgian coast, he considered it improbable that Britain could go on with the war the following year for lack of shipping. That sentence, delivered to men who had no alternative plan, settled the political argument. The cabinet approved the offensive on the 25th of July, 1917, 6 days before it began. Prime Minister David Lloyd George sat in those meetings opposed to the offensive. He doubted it would work. He feared the casualties. He lacked the political power to refuse, needing conservative support in his coalition government. and the conservatives backed Haig. He approved what he believed would fail. This fact will matter again before this story is finished. Douglas Haig, the man who had persuaded the cabinet, was 55 years old. He was the 11th child of a wealthy Edinburgh whiskey distiller, educated at Oxford without taking a degree, commissioned out of Sandhurst into the cavalry, and formed in his military thinking by the wars of empire, Sudan, and the Boer War, in which cavalry had mattered and industrial slaughter had not yet been invented. His biographer described him as an absorber of doctrine rather than an original thinker. At Sandhurst, he had been aloof, taciturn, and first in his year. He excelled at polo. He had once represented England at the game. In 1917, he held command of the largest army Britain had ever put into the field. He believed, with the complete conviction of a man who had not been contradicted by events enough times, that the German army was near collapse. One more push, one more major offensive. The reserves were exhausted, the morale was cracking, the whole structure was closer to fracture than it appeared. He had believed this before the Somme. The Somme had cost 420,000 British casualties and gained 7 miles. He emerged from it more committed to attrition, not less. Before the great offensive opened, there was a preliminary operation. Haig's Second Army, under General Sir Herbert Plumer, had spent a year tunneling beneath the German positions on Messines Ridge, south of Ypres, packing 21 mines with nearly 1 million pounds of explosive. On the 7th of June, 1917, 19 of those mines detonated simultaneously at 3:10 in the morning. The explosion killed thousands of German soldiers instantly. It was heard as far away as London. Within 3 hours, almost all of Plumer's objectives had been taken. Plumer had wanted to exploit that success immediately. Haig selected a different man to lead the main offensive instead. General Sir Hubert Gough was 46. His family had won the Victoria Cross 3 times, including his own father. He shared Haig's cavalry background and cavalry faith, and believed in wide front attacks with ambitious objectives, advances of up to 6,000 yards on the first day, breakthroughs that would allow horsemen to pour through the gap and ride for the coast. Haig and Gough were 2 men formed by the same military imagination, pointed at the same tactical problem, and constitutionally incapable of the answer that problem actually required. Plumer waited on the right flank. The 6 weeks between Messines and the opening of the main offensive, weeks in which the Germans deepened their defenses and reinforced their positions and constructed new lines of concrete bunkers, those 6 weeks were Gough's to use. The Germans used them better. The mathematics of what Haig withheld from the cabinet are worth sitting with. His own intelligence chief had documented in writing that a careful investigation of weather records for more than 80 years showed that in Flanders, the weather broke early each August with the regularity of the Indian monsoon. Once the autumn rains set in, the difficulties would be greatly enhanced. Haig's meteorological section had 16 officers and 82 men by the end of 1917. They were not absent. Their information was present and in the files. When Lloyd George asked Haig directly in the cabinet meetings before approval whether the offensive would cause heavy casualties difficult to replace, Haig replied that he thought there were no grounds for such fears. He said that, in the cabinet, on the record. The plan Gough took into the field on the 31st of July was built on 3 assumptions. The preliminary bombardment would destroy the German defenses. The infantry would advance through the gap. The cavalry would complete the breakthrough and ride northeast. Each assumption was wrong, and the mechanism by which the first assumption failed made the second and third impossible in a way that was, strictly speaking, the British Army's own doing. The Ypres salient sits on reclaimed marshland. The Flemish plain in this region lies at or below sea level in places. For centuries, engineers had maintained an intricate system of drainage channels and ditches that kept the water table controlled and the ground passable. Take away the drainage and the plain reverts to what it was before human intervention. Shell craters fill. The filled craters connect. The water table rises. The surface ceases to support weight. 3,000 guns firing 4.5 million shells over 14 days destroyed every drainage channel in the offensive zone. The bombardment that was supposed to open the path to the coast created, in its place, a substance that had no adequate name in the English language. Not mud in the ordinary sense, not swamp in the ordinary sense. Something specific to this ground and this moment, yellow-gray and cold, smelling of the decomposed bodies from 3 years of prior fighting in the same fields, firm enough to walk on one moment and yielding enough to swallow a man the next. Private Bert Ferns of the Lancashire Fusiliers wrote in his diary that it was not earth but mud, stinking, yellow, and rotten, and burnt, a thing of horror under the moon. Haig had been told the bombardment would do this. He had not told the cabinet. The German defensive system that the bombardment failed to destroy had been 12 months in preparation. Crown Prince Ruprecht of Bavaria, commanding the German army group, was satisfied by the 6th of July that his forces had ample troops and ammunition for whatever the British intended. The German Fourth Army knew the attack was coming. The front line was deliberately thinly held. The real strength lay in the second and third defensive belts, beyond the range where the preliminary barrage had done its heaviest work, in a network of concrete pillboxes designed to give interlocking fields of machine gun fire. Each pillbox was sighted so that any infantry which suppressed the fire from one would walk into the fire from 2 others. The British knew this. It was in the intelligence files alongside the weather data. At 3:50 in the morning on the 31st of July, 1917, the infantry went over. On the left, there were genuine gains. Pilkham Ridge fell, Bixschoote fell, St. Julian fell. For a few hours, in the pre-dawn darkness and the early morning, the plan appeared to be working. On the right, on the Geluvelt Plateau, the commanding ground that dominated the entire eastern salient, and without which the advance could not be sustained, the attack failed. The crucial right wing achieved almost nothing. Haig's report to the War Office that evening described the results as most satisfactory. In the afternoon of the first day, it began to rain. British artillery observers lost sight of the advancing troops and were unable to support them when the Germans counterattacked. Ground taken in the morning was lost in the afternoon. By the 2nd of August, any kind of strategic movement was all but impossible. August of 1917 was the wettest August in Flanders in 30 years. The bombardment had already destroyed the drainage, so the rainfall had nowhere to go. The shell craters filled with water. The filled craters connected into pools. The pools spread into each other until the ground between them was not ground. It was a thin crust over liquid mud, and the crust did not always hold. Men drowned in it. Not at the front, in the visible drama of combat. On the duckboard tracks, the wooden walkways the engineers had laid across the mud to allow movement. Men who slipped in the dark or were knocked sideways by a near miss went into the mud beside the duckboards, and did not come back up. The mud was deep enough to drown in and viscous enough to prevent any man from pulling himself out unaided. Horses drowned in it. The guns could not be moved on wheeled vehicles. The wheels sank immediately, so ammunition was brought forward by pack trains of horses. Horses carrying shells into the forward positions lost their footing and went down and kept going. They were not recovered. Tanks, the weapon that should have broken the German pillboxes, became immobile within yards of their starting positions. Their tracks could not find purchase in the mud. They sat where they stopped and drew artillery fire. Rifles jammed. The clay filled the mechanism and the weapon became a club. Soldiers had to clean their breeches between every shot. The Lewis guns, the light machine guns that small infantry units depended on for firepower, were so heavy that a man carrying one through waist-deep mud was, as one officer put it afterward, beyond his strength to move at all. You simply stuck in the mud. That was all. You stuck. A soldier who had been in the trenches at Ypres since June watched on his 19th birthday as Yorkshire and Lancashire men went over the top toward German positions. He watched the German machine guns cut them down. He doubted whether any of them reached the German front line. All over the battlefield, the wounded were lying there, English and German, all crying for help. He passed them. You couldn't stop. There was a thing soldiers understood about this ground and this war that does not translate easily into peacetime language. Stopping to help the wounded man in front of you was a death sentence for both of you. You walked past. By the 21st of August, nearly 70,000 men from some of Britain's best assault divisions had been killed or wounded. Haig told the government that the end of the German reserves was in sight, though the struggle might still be severe for some weeks. Sir William Robertson, Chief of the Imperial General Staff, the man whose official function was to give the War Cabinet honest military advice, was experiencing doubts he did not share with the cabinet. He told Haig, in writing, that he was sticking to the plan more because his instinct prompted him than because of any good argument he could offer in its support. He said that to Haig. He did not say it to the men who were approving the continuation of the battle. Gough said the attack should be abandoned. Haig remained confident. Then Haig made a decision that amounted, in the logic of the campaign, to a confession. He removed Gough from overall command of the offensive and gave it to the man he had passed over at the beginning, Herbert Plumer. What Plumer did with that command in the 6 weeks of September and early October 1917 stands as the clearest possible demonstration of what the battle might have been if the right man had led it from the start. Plumer was 60 years old, short and stout, with a white walrus mustache and an expression soldiers described as reassuringly grandfatherly. He did not look like the most precise mind in the British Army on the Western Front. He was. The method he applied was the structural opposite of everything Haig and Gough had planned. Instead of a wide front assault with objectives thousands of yards deep, Plumer selected a small section of the German line. He bombarded it with overwhelming concentration, one gun to every 5 yards of front at the Battle of Menin Road Ridge. He set his infantry objectives at a maximum of 1,500 yards, the distance they could reach without outrunning their artillery support. When they took the objective, they stopped. They dug in. They waited. The German counterattack would come, as it always did, to reclaim the lost ground. But it would arrive not at a disorganized mass of exhausted men at the limit of their advance. It would arrive at a prepared defensive line still within supporting artillery range, held by men who had been expecting it. The counterattack would be broken before it arrived. The Battle of Menin Road Ridge on the 20th of September. Most objectives captured on the first day. German counterattacks repulsed. A genuine success. The Battle of Polygon Wood, the 26th of September. Success. The Battle of Broodseinde, the 4th of October. Success. By the end of that day, the Allies held the ridge east of Ypres. In the German Fourth Army's headquarters, commanders were discussing whether the position could be held and whether a withdrawal was necessary. We know this because of German records examined after the war. Haig did not know it then. What he knew was that 3 attacks in succession had worked, that the momentum was real, and that it should be pressed. On the 5th of October, Haig's own intelligence chief wrote a private note. Unless fine weather held for the entire month, there was no chance of clearing the coast. Most of those at the conference, he admitted, would welcome a stop. He wrote that privately. It did not reach the men in London who were approving the continuation. On the 9th of October, Haig ordered the next attack at Poelcapelle. The weather had turned again. The ground, which had partially dried through September, was mud once more. Colder now. The shell craters deeper. The drainage more completely destroyed than it had been in July. No significant advance was made. Heavy casualties. On the 12th of October, the next attack was ordered. The New Zealanders. What happened on the 12th of October, 1917, at a gentle slope called Bellevue Spur, northeast of Ypres, was not a battle in the sense that Menin Road or Broodseinde had been battles. It was a proof that the conditions had returned to what they had been in August, that the window of Plumer's success had closed, and that the men being ordered forward knew it and said so and were sent anyway. British officer Alfred Irwin was a battalion commander. Before the attack on the 12th of October, he sent a written protest to his brigade. He had assessed the conditions and concluded that the attack could not succeed. He said this formally, in writing, through the proper channel. He was, he recalled afterward, very severely told off for sending it. His leading troops, when the attack came, got no further than 50 yards. They simply stuck in the mud. A man carrying a Lewis gun or any heavy weight could not move. It was beyond his strength. Irwin spent that night in a shell hole. His orderly was killed sitting on the edge of it. He said afterward that there was never any chance of success, that endless lives were lost that night for nothing at all. The New Zealand division went forward the same morning toward the Bellevue Spur, the final rise before Passchendaele village itself. These were experienced soldiers. Many had served at Gallipoli. They crossed ground that their own artillery had made impassable before they reached it, through shell craters filled with water, toward German wire that the barrage had cut in some places and left intact in others. Soldier Leonard Hart's letter, written afterward, describes what it was like when they reached the wire. Dozens got hung up in it and shot down before their surviving comrades' eyes. It was broad daylight. What was left of them realized the day was lost. They lay down in shell holes and waited. Any man who showed his head was immediately shot. The New Zealand division lost nearly 80% of its effective strength that day. They gained 300 yards of ground. The 300 yards were militarily useless. The Germans still held the ridge above them and dominated every foot of what the New Zealanders had paid for. The mathematics of the 12th of October deserve to sit with you for a moment. 80% of a division's strength. 300 yards. dominated immediately by the ground above. The division's total casualties at Passchendaele, 5,300 men, from a nation of 1,150,000 people, men who had crossed the world to fight. Haig ordered another attack on the 22nd of October. The assaulting troops, save those who had perished in the mud, returned to their starting line. Another attack on the 24th of October. The same outcome. He had exhausted his British and Australian and New Zealand divisions. The campaign had consumed more than 200,000 men. The village of Passchendaele was still in German hands. He turned to the Canadians. Lieutenant General Sir Arthur Currie received the order to bring the Canadian Corps to Passchendaele on the 3rd of October. He was not a professional soldier, which is one of the most important facts about him. Before the war, he had been a real estate agent in Victoria, British Columbia, who had joined the militia and discovered that the organizational and analytical skills that make a good property developer translated in ways that the British Army's professional hierarchy consistently underestimated into the skills that make a good general. He had risen through the Canadian Expeditionary Force on the basis of results. He was not a cavalryman. He was not formed by the doctrine that cavalry would settle the matter. He looked at the ground the way a man looks at a problem. What is actually here? What does it actually require? What will it actually cost? When he received the order for Passchendaele, his response was immediate. There's a mistake somewhere. It must be a mistake. It isn't worth a drop of blood. His superior confirmed there was no mistake. What Currie did next is one of the most remarkable acts of professional precision and moral courage in the entire war. He objected formally. He put his objection in writing. He stated his predicted casualty figure, 16,000 Canadians killed or wounded, and then overruled the protests noted and set aside. He applied total professional commitment to preparing the assault as well as it could possibly be prepared. He spent 2 weeks doing what no one had done before the October attacks. He ordered the construction and repair of roads and tram lines to move men and ammunition through the mud. Gun emplacements were improved. Officers were given time to study the ground. He organized the assault as a series of strictly limited operations in Plumer's method: bite and hold, limited objectives, concentrated artillery, positions consolidated before the next advance began. The Canadians built their own route to the battle before they fought it. The British and Australian and New Zealand divisions had been sent in on ground that was already impassable. The Canadians made the ground passable first. The assault opened on the 26th of October, 1917. 4 divisions of the Canadian Corps, rotating through, taking turns at the ridge across the following 2 weeks. The mud did not spare the Canadians what it had done to every army before them. Shell holes filled with water along the approach routes. Men crossing the ground in the dark became lost, the landscape having no landmarks, no reference points, nothing but craters and mud and the occasional duckboard track. A man who slipped from those tracks in the dark could drown before a stretcher-bearer reached him. Ludendorff, the German chief of staff, would write after the war that the horror of the shell hole area of Verdun had been surpassed by what the German army experienced in the Ypres salient in the autumn of 1917. He wrote that from the position of the defenders. The men attacking across that ground were moving through it, not sheltering in it. On the 6th of November, 1917, the Canadian 1st and 4th Divisions advanced the final yards and occupied the site of what had been the village of Passchendaele, approximately 5 miles from where the offensive had begun on the 31st of July. The military historian John Keegan, examining what they found, described it as a smear of brick. The British artillery barrage that had opened the battle 100 days earlier had destroyed the village completely before any Allied soldier reached it. They had won a ruin in a swamp. A Canadian corporal wrote, "Fancy fighting Germans for a land like this." Haig called off the offensive on the 10th of November. His report on the battle stated that the ultimate destruction of the enemy's field forces had been brought appreciably nearer. He considered it a success. The man who had set out to capture Ostend and Zeebrugge and the Belgian coast and the Roulers railway junction, who had told the cabinet there were no grounds for fearing heavy casualties, who had continued the battle through August's mud and October's catastrophe and the written protests of his battalion commanders, wrote that the destruction of the enemy's field forces had been brought appreciably nearer. He had captured, at a cost of 300,000 men, 5 miles of Belgian mud. Arthur Currie had predicted 16,000 Canadian casualties in writing before the assault began. The actual figure was 15,654, accurate to within 346 men. A real estate agent from British Columbia had been more precise about the cost of the battle than the field marshal commanding it had been willing to be with the men who authorized it. 4 months later, the ground was given back. In the spring of 1918, Germany launched its Great Spring Offensive on the Western Front. The British, to shorten their line and free troops to meet the German advance, abandoned the Passchendaele Ridge. The withdrawal was deliberate and organized. It was not executed under direct pressure at that moment. It was a tactical decision. The ground was not worth defending, given what defending it would cost. What had taken 100 days and 300,000 men to take was surrendered in a morning. Tyne-Cot Cemetery, the advanced dressing station the British had built on the ridge during the October fighting, fell into German hands again on the 13th of April, 1918. It would not be liberated until Belgian forces took it back on the 28th of September, 1918. The village of Passchendaele was in German hands again by April. The Roulers railway junction, the coast, the submarine bases at Bruges, none of these things had been taken. None were ever taken by the route Haig had planned. The U-boat campaign was eventually broken by the convoy system and the arrival of American naval power, not by a British infantry advance in the mud of Flanders. Haig was unrepentant. His argument that the attrition at Passchendaele had worn down the German army's reserve divisions and made the Allied victories of 1918 possible was not without merit. The German General Staff, examining the campaign after the war, wrote that Germany had been brought near to certain destruction by the Flanders Battle of 1917. The German army was genuinely weakened at Passchendaele. The British army was more genuinely weakened. The question of whether the arithmetic favored Britain requires American troops in the balance, and those troops arrived not because of what happened at Passchendaele, but because of what was happening in Washington. David Lloyd George published his war memoirs in 1938. He wrote that Passchendaele was one of the greatest disasters of the war, and that no soldier of any intelligence now defends this senseless campaign. The sentence became famous. In those memoirs, Lloyd George is the clear-eyed prime minister who tried to stop the carnage and was overridden by the generals. His memoirs do not mention what Maurice Hankey recorded in his diary on the 21st of October, 1917, while the battle was still running, that Lloyd George had deliberately allowed Passchendaele to continue in order to discredit Haig and Robertson and make it easier to prevent similar offensives in 1918. They do not mention that at the final meeting of the War Policy Committee on the 11th of October, Lloyd George had authorized the offensive to continue, warning of failure within 3 weeks, then letting it run for 3 more weeks while predicting its failure. The Prime Minister who condemned the battle most eloquently in print had the power to stop it and chose not to use it. He chose instead to let men die in order to weaken a general he could not dismiss. Robertson, the official military advisor, had told Haig, and not the cabinet, that he was supporting the offensive on instinct rather than argument. He did not resign. He did not tell the men whose approval kept the battle running that his professional judgment had failed to produce a professional case. The British official history of the war covered Passchendaele in a volume that was the last of the series to be published. There is documented evidence that it was shaped to reflect well on Haig and poorly on Gough, the convenient subordinate who could be blamed for the early failures, while the decision to choose Gough over Plumer, which was Haig's alone, went unexamined with equivalent rigor. The history of Passchendaele as commonly taught is not incorrect. It is incomplete. What it leaves out tells a story about how nations process their disasters that is as worth examining as the battle itself. The first omission is what Haig knew and suppressed. The weather data, the drainage consequence, the explicit intelligence file prediction that August in Flanders would break the offensive. The man who told the cabinet there were no grounds for fearing heavy casualties had been told, by his own staff, in writing, before he said that sentence, why there were extensive grounds for fearing exactly that. The gap between what was known and what was disclosed is not ambiguous. It is documented. It is in the files. The second omission is the nations that disappeared from the standard account. The New Zealand division, which lost 80% of its effective strength on a single day and gained 300 useless yards, does not occupy a proportionate place in the standard narrative. 38,000 Australian casualties from a nation of fewer than 5 million people are noted and moved past, and there is head win. In July of 1917, a Welsh poet named Ellis Humphrey Evans, known by his bardic name Head Wyn, which means blessed peace, posted a poem titled Ir Arwer, the hero, back to Wales from a village in France. He was killed at Pilcombe Ridge on the 31st of July, 1917, the opening day of Passchendaele. He was 30 years old. In September of that year, the National Eisteddfod of Wales, one of the great ceremonies of Welsh cultural life, was held in Birkenhead. The chair was awarded to the poet who had submitted Ir Arwer. Then came the announcement. He had been killed 6 weeks earlier, at the beginning of the battle that was still consuming men in the mud of Flanders. The chair was draped in black. The ceremony became known ever after as the Eisteddfod of the Black Chair. Lloyd George himself attended. He had approved the offensive. The chair that Head Wyn never sat in was draped in black fabric, while the man who had authorized the battle in which the poet died sat in the audience. This is Welsh national memory of Passchendaele. It is not English national memory. The battle made both. Only one of them has a chair. The third omission is the most paradoxical. The most famous story from Passchendaele is the one about Lieutenant General Sir Launcelot Kiggle, Haig's chief of staff, who, in the standard account, visited the battlefield after it was over, saw the mud, and broke down in tears. Good God, he is supposed to have said. Did we really send men to fight in that? His companion replied that it was worse further on. The story has been used for a century to represent the ignorance and insulation of the general staff, commanders who ordered men into conditions they had never seen and could not imagine. It may be entirely apocryphal. Historians examining the primary sources have found no credible contemporary evidence that Kegel said this, or that the scene occurred as described. The documented reality is worse than the legend. Haig's own diary, written throughout the battle, is full of references to the terrible weather and the difficult ground conditions. His dispatches on the campaign of 1917 record the mud explicitly. He was not ignorant of what his men were fighting in. He knew. He continued. He wrote in his final report that he considered it a success. The legend of the ignorant general weeping at conditions he had never imagined is a more comfortable story than the truth it replaced. The comfortable version exonerates through ignorance. The man didn't know. The man wept when he found out. The man felt something. The documented version allows none of that exoneration. The man knew. The man continued. The man called it a victory. What remains is the ground, and the ground does not lie. Tyne-Cot Cemetery sits on a rise of the Passchendaele Ridge, northeast of Ypres. It takes its name from the Northumberland Fusiliers, who saw in the German concrete pillboxes scattered across this section of high ground a resemblance to the workers' cottages on Tyneside. On the 4th of October, 1917, the 3rd Australian Division and the New Zealand Division captured this ground during the Battle of Broodzinde, Plumer's last success. A large German pillbox was converted into an advanced dressing station. Soldiers who died of their wounds were buried beside it. That was the beginning of the cemetery. Tyne-Cot is now the largest Commonwealth War Graves Commission cemetery in the world. Nearly 12,000 graves. The cross of sacrifice at its center was built on top of the original German pillbox at the suggestion of King George V, who visited in 1922 as the cemetery neared completion. He said, "We can truly say that the whole circuit of the earth is girdled with the graves of our dead." The memorial wall at the rear of the cemetery records the names of 33,783 Commonwealth soldiers and 1,176 New Zealand soldiers who fell in the Ypres salient after the 16th of August, 1917, and whose graves are unknown. These are the men the mud took and kept. There was not enough wall at the Menin Gate in Ypres to record all their names. The cutoff date, the 16th of August, 1917, was set arbitrarily because the stone had run out. The battle had produced more unidentified dead than a single memorial could name. 90,000 bodies were never identified. 42,000 were never recovered. The farmers of the region around Ypres still turn up human remains with their plows, shells, wire, bones, identity discs. They call it the Iron Harvest. There is a Belgian protocol for it. New graves are still being dug at Tyne-Cot. The battle ended in November of 1917. It is still returning its dead. In Wales, the black chair, the carved ceremonial chair draped in mourning at the 1917 Eisteddfod, is preserved at Headwind's family farm, Ir Ysgorn, in Snowdonia. The farm itself is now a national monument. Wales remembers Passchendaele through a poet's empty chair. England remembers it through the story of a general who may never have said what he is supposed to have said. The battle made both memories. One of them is a myth. One of them is a chair, still draped in black, in a farmhouse in North Wales. Siegfried Sassoon, the soldier poet who fought on the Western Front and wrote about it with a clarity that the official version could not contain, published a poem in 1918 called Memorial Tablet. It is the voice of a dead man. He gives the battle its most compressed verdict. "I died in hell," he wrote. They called it Passchendaele. The ground between Ypres and the Passchendaele Ridge is 8 kilometers. It took 100 days and 300,000 men to cross it. It was given back in a morning. What changed was not the line on the map, which barely moved, and then moved back. What changed was the arithmetic of what Britain was willing to authorize, and who would be trusted to authorize it. Lloyd George spent the remainder of the war keeping divisions out of Haig's hands. Robertson lost his position. Gough lost his command, dismissed the following year with no ceremony and no acknowledgement that the man who had chosen him bore any share of the consequence. Plumer, who had been right from the beginning, continued in command and acquitted himself with distinction elsewhere. Haig lived until 1928. His funeral was a day of national mourning. Hundreds of thousands lined the streets of Edinburgh. The men who had fought at Passchendaele were in those crowds. They did not leave. That fact has its own weight, and the men who were present for it understood its weight better than the historians who have argued about Haig ever since. The Tyne Cot Memorial Wall holds 34,000 names. 42,000 bodies were never found. The total Allied advance, 8 kilometers. The time required to give it back, 1 morning. The wall at Tyne Cot is made of Portland stone. The names are cut into it in alphabetical order by regiment. There are enough of them that if you tried to read each name aloud at a normal speaking pace without stopping, it would take you more than 3 days. In the comments, tell me which of these facts you were not taught, because I have a feeling it isn't the mud. I think it's the meeting in London in June, and what Haig said, and what he did not say. Subscribe, because there is more where this came from, and most of it has the same shape. The documents are there, the truth is in them, and someone decided a long time ago that it was better left in the files